So we should be starting with the live stream very shortly. Okay, and we should be live. Okay, so hi everyone. Welcome to our International Primatology Lecture Series, Past, Present, and Future Perspectives from the Field. I'm Andrew McIntosh, an Associate Professor at Kyoto University's Primate Research Institute, and I'll be chairing and moderating this event. So this is part of the Center for International Collaboration and Advanced Studies in Primatology's Seminar in Science Communication. And through this initiative, our aim is to provide a bunch of origin stories from either about the careers of well-known primatologists and allied fields, or about the evolution of their big ideas. And so this is the 10th lecture in our series. And in partnership with the PWS program, we're happy and excited to be able to invite Professor Andrew Whiten to join and share his story with us. So to get us started, as usual, I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Mike Hoffman for an introduction.
Thanks a lot, Andrew. Welcome, Andy. It's good to see you. I'd like to welcome everyone else to this talk today. It's really great that we can combine this time with the symposium. So there's a lot of people who might not have the opportunity to listen to Andy's story quite in this way, although I'm sure everyone is well aware of the amazing work that he's done over the years. Just to give a brief introduction, Andy got his PhD in Bristol in 1972, I believe. Then he moved on to Oxford as a research fellow, and then shifted to St. Andrews, where he's continued his work for many, many years and has put together some amazing studies. He's published close to 300 papers so far. I'm sure it's not even near the end. Every year he sends these lovely lists of recent update papers and things, and it's always great to keep caught up. That's about the only way I can keep up with everything that he and his group has published, but it's really all amazing stuff. He's been spending a long time studying primates, and including humans, children, and a number of different human societies around the world. But the focus that many of us in primatology know the most is his interesting work with social learning and cultural traditions in animals. He's really been at the forefront of this area of work for many, many years. I first met Andy in 1986, I believe, at the Göttingen IPS meetings, and I was sitting up in the front, still very green behind the ears and very eager to listen to all the scientists talk about their work. And like no other talk during that time and anything since then, I believe, I saw two speakers standing together giving a talk simultaneously or shifting back and forth. It was Dick Byrne and Andy that were talking about tactical deception in baboons, some of the work that they had done in South Africa. And he published a nice book in the area of Machiavellian intelligence with Dick. But I think what really stands out over the last several years is the work that he's done in the wild as well as in captivity with a number of primate species. And I think it probably started with the work in chimpanzees, comparing different sites in the field. At least that's when it really picked up a lot of attention with his first paper in 1999 in Nature about chimpanzee cultures. And I remember we were sitting on a bus, I think it was the IPS meetings in Japan. He was visiting us in Inuyama, and I was sitting next to him on the bus, and he said, do you think that chimpologists would be interested in sharing their information about what they're seeing at these different sites? I want to see if chimpanzees have culture, if we can detect cultural differences between populations. And I thought for a minute, and I said, Andy, I think you're the only one that could do it. To get a chimpologist to get everyone else in his group to share data with them is very difficult. Everyone's really keen on publishing their own stuff. But Andy did it. He got everyone together, and it's really been some impressive follow-up work after that. So I think I will stop here. Andy's got a lot to tell us, a lot to share with us today. But I'd like to thank you, Andy, for taking the time to joining us today. And I'll let you at it. Thank you very much. we're going to play his video now. He wanted to be sure that everything would be good. He's on the road at the moment. So we'll have the video, and then Andy will come back at the end of that and we'll take questions.
Hello, I'm Andy Whiten, and I'm talking to you from sunny St Andrews. As you know, the title of my talk is The Discovery and Reach of Culture in Primates Lives. And this is in part based on a review I had published in the journal Science last year called The Burgeoning Reach of Animal Culture. And by culture, here I mean information or behaviours that are shared and sustained across a group, and that's because they're acquired through some form of social learning from others. And in this review I talk about several different aspects of the reach of animal culture. I'm going to run through. The first two are the reach across animal taxa, across many different species, and the second is across many different behavioural domains. Concerning species and domains, this illustration on the opening page of the review, if I just blow it up, illustrates several of these. So top left here we have some of the evidence for social learning of migration routes in birds. Here these birds have been imprinted on this microlight aircraft, and so they will follow it, and that will lay down new migratory pathways for the cranes illustrated here. In B we have a very different example from fruit flies, mate choice copying. So here a female on the left is watching as a male who's been dusted green by experimenters mates with a female. A male that's been dusted pink doesn't get any look in, and that female who's watching will later show the same kind of preference for a green dusted male, and that preference will be passed on to other females in turn. Then in C we have bighorn sheep that have been shown in the wild to extend their migratory pathways, particularly their spring migrations up to better pastures over time, over decades and over generations, illustrating cultural transmission. Then in D, we have our first primate example, experiments I'll talk about later, where in vervet monkeys it's been shown through these experiments that diet preferences are passed on culturally. E is teaching about catching and dispatching scorpions in meerkats, and the final one is lobtail feeding in humpback whales that was first observed in just a couple of whales over 20 years ago, but then in the period since it's spread to over 600 whales. And all these examples, these diverse examples, come from the recent pages of the journal Science. So they're high-profile, important studies. Inside the review I've included another figure with more illustrations. Let me just pick out from these, which as you can see cover cetaceans, primates, birds, fish and insects. Let me pick out the three primate ones. First of all, the chimpanzee one there in B. This was from an African sanctuary, and in just one of 4 enclosures at this sanctuary, one chimpanzee, a female, started putting a leaf of grass in her ear. And over time, that spread to most of her group. Apparently functionless behaviour, but just a social custom that spread across this group. In C, we see a young capuchin watching an adult using a stone to crack nuts, and there's evidence in that study that they learn to observe and benefit from what they learn from the best nutcrackers. And then in E, we see bonobos. In this study by Liran Simuni and colleagues, there were 2 communities of bonobos with a very large overlap range between them. And in that range, surprisingly, one community tended to hunt. When they were hunting, they'd prefer to hunt duikers, whereas the other community had a very different preference for various species of rodents. And that can't be explained by genetics, because there's genetic interchange between the communities, nor by ecology, because of course they're all hunting in the same area, and therefore this could be attributed to a cultural difference. So just a few examples there from across different species of primates, and also non-primate species as well. If we look at domains of behavior, well, they now span pretty much all kinds of behavior that one can think of. Some of these are more prominent in non-primates. So, for example, in this list we have vocal communication, and social learning of that doesn't seem to be particularly common amongst primates, but is really important in cetaceans and in songbirds, as is learning of migration routes, again seen in whales and in many species of birds, but not really a feature of primate cultures. But all these other aspects are seen. Well, that's a quick introduction to the review, and I'm going to come back to that. But now let me talk about the history, or the early history, of the discovery of these cultures in animals' lives. And this is really a 70-year story, at the start of which, of course, Japanese research was really important on the famous case of sweet potato washing amongst Japanese macaques. And I was very pleased to find, as I was preparing this talk, in my collection of paper reprints from earlier times, one from Dr. Kawai himself, actually signed. I can't remember where this came from, but I was delighted to find it. And in fact, I met Dr. Kawai at a conference in Kyoto 20 years ago. There I am on the left with him in the middle. You can probably recognize Frans de Waal there on the right. Well, sadly, Dr. Kawai passed away recently, and a whole issue of the journal Primates was devoted to his memory and the research, the wonderful research he did. I was invited to write one of these, and there it is in memoriam. And I talked about the foundations of cultural primatology, particularly illustrated by this 1965 paper. And reading it again, I was really impressed how it anticipated many of the later developments. I'm going to just quickly pick out four. One is that it anticipated what's been called network-based diffusion analyses, sophisticated statistical approaches to trace the spread and diffusion of traditions. Well, those weren't available to Kawai, but nevertheless, he and his colleagues described the way in which these early traditions did spread across matrilines and then across the wider community, and just how that happened. Secondly, he recognized what's since been called, and most recently been labeled, peering. This is this very close attention that young primates may show to others, and we'll come back to that. Mostly emphasized in this recent paper by Caroline Schuckley and Carol van Schaik, Animal Cultures, how they claim we've seen only the tip of the iceberg. This is a 2019 paper, and they say that because if you look closely at what youngsters peer at, well, in their orangutans, they identified in one community over 190 different contexts. What Kawai said was, being always with their mothers, babies stare at their mother's behavior, while mothers are doing sweet potato washing behavior. And he inferred, therefore, that the process of propagation in this period is always from mother to child. Thirdly, I think there was admirable, very fine-grained ethology in this paper. My background is ethology. I'm full of admiration for really good observation, clever observation and recording of differences in this case, which suggested putative cultural variance between different families or communities. For example, differences in styles of sweet potato washing, he said, such as holding the item in one hand and brushing with the other, or rolling it in the water, or repeated dipping in the sea between bites. Well, that's got its modern descendants as well, so I'm going to illustrate this from a paper from chimpanzees in Central Africa who fish for subterranean termites by first of all using a very stout stick to dig down and make a tunnel, often much deeper than illustrated here. It could be 60 centimeters or more. That makes a tunnel down to the subterranean nest, and then the chimpanzees put that stick aside and use a fine fishing probe that they've brought in their mouth, again sometimes half a meter long, and that's fed down the tunnel, and the termites bite on it and the chimpanzee pulls them out and eats them. Well, in a study, a large survey by Christoph Busch and his colleagues, they found differences in this behavior across the central part of Africa. The diagram or the map there at top right illustrates the communities studied. And what they showed is that if you distinguish in this fine way different behaviors that they make when they're arriving at the nest, or then when they're perforating the nest, the posture, the body position and posture, the ways in which they modify the tool, and then the various manual techniques they use, well, you can distinguish each of these 6 communities. Each of these communities has its own unique, particularly array of these patterns of behavior. We can come back to Japanese macaques with another example of this, I think, which is very nice. Comes from the work of Mike Huffman and his colleagues on the strange behavior of some Japanese monkeys of stone handling. You see illustrations of the various ways in which they've done it. But in one paper they distinguished 45 different ways in which these macaques manipulate the stones. Here they are listed, and again, if you mark out how common these different behaviors are at different sites, you come up with the conclusion that each has its own unique array of these. Again, different cultures in this very particular form of behavior of stone handling. The fourth feature I picked out was cumulative cultural evolution, which is a topic of great current controversy, an argument, some arguing that cumulative cultural evolution is unique to our own species, and of course it is amazingly complicated in our own species. But there are also signs of it in other species. People have argued, and in this review by Daniel Schofield and colleagues, I think Daniel's actually participating in this meeting, well, there's a full analysis of the various ways in which, for example, sweet potato washing evolved from washing in streams to washing in the sea to seasoning the food in the sea, and then that led in turn on to other behaviors such as frolicking in the sea and swimming in the sea and so on. So a wonderful start here, but this wasn't the only start to the discovery of animal cultures, far from it. In the UK, for example, these little blue tits and great tits were observed to start raiding milk bottles which had these little aluminium foil caps on top. And this behaviour started in just a couple of locations, it was observed, and then it gradually spread and diffused across the UK. Another example from birds has to do with bird song and bird song dialects. So bird song was shown by experimental work to be often socially learned, associated that were culturally transmitted dialects, first of all discovered by Peter Marler and Tamura, and this illustration I've put in here is from a later study, but I use that one because you can see from the spectrographs there of the bird song, they can all be identified, yes, as white-crowned sparrow song, but they all have their local variations, their local dialects. And interestingly, I think the early study of the milk bottle opening, it wasn't actually cited by the Japanese researchers, and similarly the other way around. The Marler and Tamura study was 1964, could have cited some of the earlier work and the early discoveries coming out about the Japanese macaques, but these weren't all connected up at this stage. It's only later we've realized that there was a broad pattern of animal culture starting to be revealed in these diverse studies of birds and mammals. Later in the century, primates again became particularly important, and the studies of chimpanzees by Jane Goodall and others were brought together, for example, in this landmark volume by Jane, 1986, comparing variations that seem to be emerging in ways of behaving across 4 main study communities, and as you can see there, 2 of them are the Japanese chimpanzee research sites. I've just expanded a little section there where you can see in this example at the bottom, grass or small stems are used for termite fishing, but really rather different in size in what is being selected and used at Gombe versus Mahali. Over time, this work extended, and in fact, even before then, there was this paper published, and again, led by the Japanese chimpanzee researcher Nishida and other colleagues from Gombe, suggesting that local differences in plant feeding habits weren't all explicable by ecological differences, and therefore were suggestive of cultural variations. By 1992, there was scope for a whole book on the topic. So here we have Chimpanzee Material Culture by Bill McGrew, including items like this table here, in which he went further than Jane Goodall to start recording many different behaviours across several different sites. Others did the same. Christoph Birsch, for example, started doing this. But these were all based on published reports. Now that has the deficit that, of course, not all publications record what really doesn't happen at sites, which is very interesting, and other information too. So by the turn of the century, I was delighted to be able to persuade all the leaders of the long-term study sites to pool their information and come up with a systematic approach. And here's a summary of the results. This diagram at the top here, illustrating our conclusion that chimpanzees have as many as 39 cultural variants across Africa, spanning most of their kinds of behaviour: foraging techniques, tool use, social behaviour, courtship gambits, grooming patterns, and so on. And this is a rather different story than the way things had started out decades earlier, noticing specific traditions like bird song or milk bottle opening or sweet potato washing. Here we have the suggestion that some animal cultures may be really rather rich sets or arrays of traditions. In fact, each of these locations having its own unique array of traditions. So that's my quick story of the discovery of animal culture as it unfolded. However, that early work was often based on just observations, so which makes it difficult to be sure that you're seeing social learning. So I coupled that research with experimental studies in which we could be sure that social learning was responsible. And this illustrates the results of several of these studies, which employ what we call the two-action methodology, and also what we call transmission or diffusion chain methodology. So to give one example, here we have what we call the panpipes device. One chimpanzee was taken from her group temporarily and shown that one way to get the grape out from behind this blockage that it was stuck behind is to stick a stick in this hole, push the blockage back, knock the grape off the back, and the grape would then roll forward and the chimpanzee would get it. She was then reunited with her group, and we could see how she and they later behaved. Over here, however, in a separate group, one chimpanzee was shown the same problem, but that you could use your stick to get underneath this little sort of branch here, pull the obstacle up out of the way, and the grape would then roll forward and you could get it. So here, this single chimpanzee who's been shown the poke technique did that, and that gradually spread across her whole group. Whereas over here, the one chimpanzee that introduced the lift technique, that was what spread across the group. Although some individuals discovered that while trying to do that, they would discover the other technique. But nevertheless, a broad and significant group in incipient traditions between the two communities. And in these later studies at Bastrop in Texas with the more complicated devices, in fact. The same differences you can see in the blue coded here, or the pale green, showing that these different groups are picking up what the first individual we trained is doing. And moreover, when this second group here could watch what this first group were doing, they adopted the similar techniques, and a third group who could watch them developed the same techniques, very different from what happened across these other three groups over here. So now strong experimental evidence, yes, chimpanzees can sustain the kind of cultural variations that we're suggesting is consistent with all the information from the wild. Well, that's a quick summary of where we've got to in the early discovery of animal cultures, really looking at the last century. In the present century, the study of animal culture has really exploded, which is what this review is about. So in addition to the reach across animal taxa and across behavioural domains I've outlined already, I've talked about the reach through the lifetime across different aspects of cognition, particularly, of course, social learning processes, what are called social learning biases, for example, who's best to learn from, and then other disciplines, gene culture, coevolution, and implications for anthropology and implications for evolutionary biology, very much linked to gene culture, coevolution. Finally, I'll say a little bit about the implications for conservation that are increasingly being discussed and even implemented. So let's go back and look at reach through the lifetime. I recently published this review with Erica van der Waal, in which we divided the role of social learning in primate lifetime development into three main phases. It's not true of all primates, but certainly many seem to start with this focus on maternal behavior, because the youngster is being fed by the mother, often carried around by the mother, and therefore watches many of the techniques. And what's illustrated rather nicely in these two photographs is this peering behavior that Caroline Schuppel has drawn our attention to. Again, here an illustration from the orangutans that she studies. And this, as I said, was the basis for them saying we've really only seen the tip of the iceberg, and if you really focus on that behavior, then in one of their communities they found as many as 190 different contexts in which young apes are peering in this way, apparently taking in the information, leading to the conclusion that when looking closely at great ape skill acquisition, it seems that immatures learn virtually all of their skills socially. So that's phase one. Then in second phase, there's a widening social network, and youngsters start to take information from others. I mentioned earlier on this illustration here of a youngster starting to watch the best nutcrackers. And this is particularly important in species that are sexually dimorphic. So, for example, in gorillas or orangutans, where the adult males are so much larger than others, they have a somewhat different diet. And so a young male can learn only so much more from his mother, and later then tends to apprentice himself to an adult male. And new studies are describing this in more and more detail. The third phase is at dispersal. So now we're looking at adults who are dispersing to other groups, avoiding inbreeding, but that often takes them into new habitats and, of course, into new social groups where there's more role for social learning. We discovered something about this in a study, an experimental study, again in collaboration with Erica van der Waal, in which we exploited the fact that once a month groups of vervet monkeys were being given a box of sweet corn to use to tell quickly what the different ranks of the monkeys were. But what we did was take this a stage further and separate it into two boxes, one dyed pink, one dyed blue. And initially we made one of those very distasteful by putting some material in it that they didn't like, and as a result, illustrated at the bottom here, is that we ended up with two groups who ate the blue and ignored the pink, and 2 groups did the opposite. They ate the pink and ignored the blue. And the first thing we found was that when we removed the nasty material and offered the pink and the blue to infants, they tended to prefer the one that their mothers were eating. Sometimes they'd sit on the other one to eat it, even though now it was perfectly palatable and nutritious. But what we were really lucky in, and illustrates this third phase, was that males, as they matured, migrated between groups, and 10 of them actually migrated between the groups, such as they had been in a group where everyone tended to eat blue and ignore the pink, and they moved into another community where they look around and everyone's eating the pink and ignoring the blue, doing the opposite. What would they do? What would you do? What do you think they would do? Well, what we found to our surprise was that 9 out of 10 of them very quickly switched to the local preference. They're doing what we have this expression in English, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. And you can imagine, if you go on holiday to Rome, let's say, and you're looking for a good restaurant, you see one restaurant which is full of people enjoying their food, another one is pretty much empty. Well, you know which one the locals know is the best. And it seems that these vervet monkeys are following a similar kind of rule of thumb. So that's a quick summary of the role of social learning through the lifetime in primates. What about social learning? What about across cognition? Well, of course, first of all, social learning processes. Over time, our studies of social learning have produced more and more complex taxonomies of the different kinds of social learning, and I don't have time to go through all of these. This illustrates the more complicated ones at the top and the simplest ones at the bottom. The simplest ones at the bottom are just really drawing attention to things such as this food rather than that food. But illustrating imitation and the copying of behavior, I did this study where 4 chimpanzees each watched a human model opening this thing we call an artificial food in different ways, using different sequences of behavior and different particular techniques. So this model here is removing these bolts by pulling and then pulling and then pulling and then pulling until they've got one out, and then the next one, and then they spin the pin, this thing here, and manage to get that out, and that enables them finally to remove the handle, and then they can open the lid and get the food out. Whereas the model that this chimpanzee saw did it the other way around. They first of all spun the pin, got the pin out, then the handle, and then they pulled the bolts out. Well, in fact, they didn't just pull them out, but they poked them out with their finger, so using a different technique. And as you can see from the bottom line, which shows what each chimpanzee did after it watched the model several times, there was a statistically significant tendency to follow not only some of the details of the behavior they'd seen, some of which, like was spinning the pin, were not actually necessary, but also the overall structure of the behavior, something my colleague Dick Byrne, has called program level imitation. But then, somewhat differently, there's a form of copying in which all that's copied is the end or outcome of an action sequence. So much lower fidelity copying, just focusing on what happens at the end and producing it in a different way. And a nice illustration of this, I think, comes from a study by Claudio Teni and colleagues, where chimpanzees were shown that you could get a peanut out of the bottom of this flask here by pouring water in, so that the water would make the peanut raise up and they could get the peanut out. So that was done by using a bottle of water. But then the chimpanzees didn't have a bottle of water. And what some of them did, nevertheless, was to go to their water drinker, take mouthfuls of water and come and spit it into the flask so they could get the peanut out. So that's emulation. In addition to social learning processes, there are social learning biases. And this has also eventuated in complex taxonomies of the different cues that can be used to make one's social learning more efficient. Again, I don't have time to go through all of these, of course, but this is what's listed by Rachel Kendall and colleagues in a recent review. For example, one focus is a kind of frequency-dependent focus, such as copying the majority. An example of that we saw in those vervet monkeys, copying what a majority of individuals in their new group preferred to do. Evidence also from chimpanzees and humans in other kinds of studies. Model-based strategies are focused on, well, who's the best model to copy? And there's evidence from chimpanzees and children in one study led up by Rachel Kendall that they can tell who's the most knowledgeable chimpanzee in a particular context, perhaps the most confident and the most knowledgeable, and copy them. And then there's a bias for the better payoff, and recognizing, that behavior gives you the better payoff, and focusing in on that on other primates too. So that's social learning processes and social learning biases, but there's other research which I'm not going to go into affecting cognition, because of course you need innovations to have complex cultures and for it to be sustained, some kind of cultural memory in the community. What next? Well, let's look together at implications for evolutionary biology of all these discoveries, and that links with the phenomenon of gene culture co-evolution. I've talked about this using this expression of a second inheritance system. That's to say, social learning, learning from others, is a second kind of inheritance built on the shoulders of the primary inheritance system, which of course characterizes all life, the genetic system. But once we've got this second inheritance system, then there's the possibility of a second form of evolution, cultural evolution. And the researcher on cetaceans, Hal Whitehead, was the first to recognize the scope there for interaction and co-evolution between this cultural kind of evolution and genetically based evolution, gene culture co-evolution. And recently I and others joined Hal in this broader review on the reach of gene culture co-evolution in animals. In primates, one interesting example to illustrate this comes from the fact that I showed earlier on how complex are the cultures of chimpanzees. Our studies were soon followed by those by Karel van Schaik and colleagues, showing that orangutan cultures also extend into the dozens or even over 30 been listed nowadays, and more recently collaboration between gorilla researchers revealed over 22 different cultural variants or traditions amongst or between different communities of gorillas. So all of these great apes seem to have complex cultures, and of course they've also got large brains, and the cultural intelligence hypothesis suggested that these two things may well be linked. That's to say that intelligence and encephalization, and the genetic basis of this, have perhaps co-evolved with cultural complexity evolving, and we've described this in several papers. I'll illustrate two ways of testing this, which is quite difficult to do. One comes from the Karel van Schaik group, where they suggested that if this cultural intelligence hypothesis is operating, then there should also be pressure on individual level cognition to benefit from and apply what can be picked up from one's culture. And sure enough, Sumatran orangutans were shown in this study, who in the wild have the more complex cultures, have some signs of greater cognitive capacity in when they're studied in captivity, for example, across different zoos, and also have slightly larger brains, only slightly larger but significantly so. So there's a contrast amongst orangutans, but there's a second study here I'll illustrate, which instead surveys across 52 different primate genera, looking at 4 aspects of behavior, cognition and encephalization, and that's what these the graphical illustrations are here, to do with social learning, brain volume, group size and longevity. And if I just highlight the great apes, you can see that they score highly often on 2 or more of these. In fact, the conclusion of the paper was that using these sophisticated statistical analyses, they found a positive relationship with reliance on culture, which is measured by reported richness of social learning, but corrected for research effort, and both absolute and relative brain volume. So, some evidence there. This work continues and also continues to be controversial. What about implications for anthropology? Well, in my own research, the approach I've taken is a phylogenetic comparison. So if we look across different primates, we'll say if we focus in on the great apes, well, of course, all of us great apes share certain morphological characteristics, the form of our bodies, the fact we don't have a tail, our basic form of locomotion, rather different from monkeys. Well, from all of this, you can make inferences about what a common ancestor between ourselves and chimpanzees was likely like, and also the common ancestor of all the great apes. Illustrations here from Richard Dawkins' The Ancestor's Tale. Well, we can take a similar approach when we're looking at behavior and cultural cognition. And that's what I've done in a review. Again, rather complicated picture I'm going to show you, and I don't have time to illustrate all of this. But for three aspects of culture: population level patterning, so how traditions are patterned in time and space; different aspects of social learning processes, perhaps most importantly, but also cultural content such as tool use. Well, we find shared features when we're looking at ourselves and chimpanzees, the species that's best studied. Really quite a long list. Of course, many are very distinctive in humans. I'm not disputing that our cultures are enormously different and very complicated compared to anything we see in any other species. Nevertheless, there are these similarities which suggest that our common ancestor possessed some of these characteristics from which the complexities of human culture have evolved. Finally, let me say just a little bit about the implications for conservation. I was delighted when just a few years ago the Organization of the United Nations, the United Nations Environment Programme, who are concerned particularly with the Convention on the Conservation of Migratory Species, because of course there it's important that there's collaboration between contiguous United Nations for conservation of those species. They've recognized the importance of culture in understanding animal behavior nowadays, and they drew together a workshop to look at this more closely just a few years ago in Parma, Italy. And it so happens that great apes, or at least the chimpanzee and gorilla so far, have been put on the appendices of this convention because although they're not migratory in any conventional way, they have such large home ranges that they span sometimes 2 or even 3 continuous range states. So there's the same scope for collaborative action. And together, over 3 days, we produced a 30-page report, or at least later we refined that report. That's available on the CMS website. But we produced a 2 or 3 page summary in the Science Insights section. For those of you who'd like to look at that, you can find that dating from 2019. But then just from last year, there's a fuller analysis and proceedings of the Royal Society of the lessons that are starting to be learned and, moreover, implemented. So one of these was implemented in a resolution at the last Conference of the Parties, that's to say the kind of United Nations meeting that includes representatives from all the range states, which took part in India, and a proposal was approved for a concerted action, now not about a particular species or subspecies, but about a particular culture, the nutcracking cultures of chimpanzees, which seems to be isolated just in the far parts of West Africa. So that's now being explored. But our sister conservation body, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, IUCN, already in 2010, in this report from Andrew Plumtree and colleagues, was talking about ensuring the long-term survival and the full range of ecological and cultural diversity. So the concern was already there then, and in this table here, what they were doing was taking our list from the 1999 Nature paper and its follow-up a few years later, and seeing to what extent that might now be extended and express the cultural diversity which deserves to be conserved. And in fact, in a similar effort for now Western chimpanzees, led by Erin Westling, there's a similar emphasis on cultural diversity, and I'm pleased to say efforts to collaborate between this organisation, the IUCN Great Ape Special Great Section on Great Apes, and the CMS group that I referred to earlier. So that's been a lightning run through some of the main elements that I've been looking at in the discovery, and particularly now the reach, as we're seeing it, of culture in primates' lives. I'm just going to quickly finish, if I may, with a plug for a meeting which is actually only just about a week away now, 14th to the 15th of March, that I'm the lead organiser for at the Royal Society, The Emergence of Collective Knowledge and Cumulative Culture in Animals, Humans and Machines. This is a hybrid meeting, so there's 100 of us allowed into the building, but many more than that are registered online. If you want to join and be registered online, just go to the Royal Society website, look at the conferences section, and you can register to attend and to participate. Okay, so I'll finish with thanks to all my collaborators in various aspects of these researchers over the years, over the decades really, and thanks to the many organisations that have funded us. So, thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions.
Okay, that was excellent. Really happy to have been a part of that. Thank you very much, Professor Whiten. So we do have time for questions. Let me just share back up here the slide for this event. I think we're a little bit late according to the schedule, but if I'm not wrong, we don't have anything else coming up for today. So maybe we'll try and get the 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A if that's okay.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you perfectly. Thanks.
Yeah.
Good. Okay.
Does that work for you, Andy? Extra time?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, good.
Okay. So if anyone from the audience has questions, as we maybe wait for, sorry, I'm trying to arrange my screen so I can make sure I don't miss anything. Yeah, so we have one question already in the Q&A from Satoshi Hirata. And he said, thanks for the wonderful talk. Kind of a beginner question, he says. What's the key difference between human culture and non-human, for example, chimpanzee culture? Maybe cumulative culture is one such difference, but do you have any comments and ideas other than that? And he says, sorry, but I have to leave at 6 p.m. for another engagement. So I guess you have 3 minutes to answer.
Okay. Well, I'd agree. I think there's quite a common consensus that one of the differences is in the scope of our cumulative culture. So, and if you just think of one example, such as technology, back a million years ago, then we're starting to see the beginnings of material technology, and then over the millennia it just becomes more and more complex in an apparently accelerating way. I mean, all of us listening here has seen the evolution of digital technology. I typed my PhD on a typewriter, and now we're doing all this. I mean, there's nothing you might say remotely comparable in the non-human world to the scope of our cumulative culture. And of course, it's not just technology. Another completely different example is the way our languages have evolved. So I think that is probably the key. And for long, it's been argued that only our species has this cumulative culture. One of the big controversies and points of debate at the moment is there is now increasing evidence for cumulative culture of more elementary kinds in primates and various other species. I think the example, when I was talking about the subterranean termite fishing, that seems to me a good candidate. The problem that we've often got there, though, is, we don't have the same history we have of something like the history of the wheel, which we have in the human case. We've got all these pictures of the way the wheel, for example, evolved. We often don't have that history in the non-human case. So that's my attempt at a 3-minute answer.
That was right on cue. Perfect. I'm sure that Hirata-san can now depart.
Yeah, I can give him the 1 hour answer another time. Yeah, and nice to hear from him. Hi.
All right. So as we wait for more questions to come up on the board, I had one, at the risk of sounding a little controversial. I don't mean to be controversial at all, but it just struck me because of this, let's say, increasing interest in cultures and conservation and what you finished your talk on. Normally, we think of conservation of species as focused on factors that influence reproductive success in wildlife. And then almost by definition, at least in terms of animal cultures, we kind of want to remove the fitness possibility in there, because then you could use other arguments for why those behaviors have emerged. So can you elaborate a bit then on why, well, first of all, maybe you can comment on that kind of at least seeming paradox, but also maybe elaborate a bit on why we should be concerned about loss of culture in wildlife in the conservation context?
Yeah. Well, I guess it is the case that the way we started to describe what we thought was the putative richness of chimpanzee culture was the paper that Mike referred to and I talked about in my talk of chimpanzee cultures, where our approach was to look at different study sites, compare them, and try and pick out behaviors that we thought couldn't really be related to ecology, and in that sense, I think relates to your point. Perhaps weren't particularly adaptive, but nevertheless are different. And if you can set aside ecological explanations and genetic explanations, then by exclusion, you're left with the conclusion that this is perhaps cultural. But that was really just a sort of a technique for getting at this issue to begin with in that way. And by contrast with that, I would say that a lot of research is indicating that culture is, in fact, importantly adaptive. And so there may be differences amongst different communities in the particular ways in which a behavior is done. But in each of them, it's performing an adaptive function. And what that means is that this cultural knowledge is built up. I mentioned the example from the orangutans and Caroline Shipley's analyses indicating that there may be hundreds of different aspects of behavior that young orangutans are picking up on, incorporating. They're really benefiting from a huge corpus of cultural knowledge. And if that's taken away, then, that community may really be in trouble. And I guess we can probably see that in the case, one of the examples where this has already come into effect is efforts to rehabilitate communities into the wild. And a good example of that is the Golden Lion Tamarin project which was handled out of the National Zoo in Washington. And they started introducing golden lion tamarins, which are highly endangered, back into the wild, but with very poor success to begin with, huge mortality. And then what they discovered over time was that if they could arrange that the ones to be reintroduced could get some benefit from the experience of some residents, then mortality was very much less. So I think that's just one example where the scope of cultural knowledge can be recognized to be really important for conservation. I hope does that make some sense? Answer your question to some extent?
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you. And it reminded me too that there's a couple of talks already in today's seminar or symposium, like about elephants, for example, where the importance of understanding individual behavior patterns that are learned are really important for mitigating human-wildlife conflict.
Yes. Elephants is a sort of classic example by now, I suppose, of where the matriarchs are, as it were, reservoirs of this cultural knowledge, some of which may go back decades of, where the water hole is, that if you get there in a major drought, that can save this little band of elephants. But it may be only the matriarch who knows that. And so from a conservation point of view, I think there's, in certain species which are actually harvested, there was a notion amongst conservationists, just take the big ones and, leave the little ones because, the young ones, then they can grow up and breed. But in fact, what that misses out is the fact that the elder ones may be the ones that are these reservoirs of cultural knowledge, and taking them out may be disastrous. And, the elephant matriarch is almost a symbolic example of that.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much. If we have any other questions from the audience, I don't see anything up on the board right now. Here comes one from Brian Lee. Says, thanks for the great talk, Dr. Whiten. I was wondering, what's your perspective on social learning bias's impact on establishment of culture? So social learning bias. Especially on the prestige bias learning. So do you think prestige bias strategies can be considered as a predominant feature in non-human animals?
Well, hello. Thanks for that question. And I corresponded with you yesterday, I think, because I took some time to look at some of the posters, and yours was one of the ones that I found very interesting. So thanks for your question. Yeah, there's a whole range of social learning strategies or biases. Prestige is one which we've got some experimental evidence for. We found doing experiments with those communities which I showed that complex experimental social transmission set of results for, that there was a tendency to focus on high status individuals, but it was more complicated than that, because I've interacted with the phenomenon that I mentioned in the Rachel Kendall et al. Study, that those who are more knowledgeable could also be picked out, maybe from the way they confidently moved around because of what they knew, and others focused on them too. What the true story about this is may impact on the whole question of cumulative culture, because once an innovation comes about, that might be from a low-ranking individual, it may tend, therefore, not to spread so well because everyone's attending to high-ranking individuals, not paying too much attention to this innovative juvenile. So it's a complicated picture that's emerging.
Okay, thanks for the question. If there are any more, we might have a couple more minutes.
I'll be happy if people are shy, but would prefer to email me. I'm sure you can find my email address, aw2 at St Andrews works. I'll be happy to field those.
Thank you. So let me fill this gap briefly here. Mike in the introduction mentioned that you spoke with him about trying to wrangle the chimpologists together. So I wonder if you can maybe tell us how that worked for you. I suppose what he meant was someone who's not directly like a head of a field site of chimpanzees, but someone coming kind of from the outside, quote unquote.
Yes. I think as a group, we probably agree that, that was quite important as a sort of little kind of case study in the sociology of science, I suppose we might say. I'm not sure I can recollect exactly what the steps were, but I could see, because Mike Tomasello had invited me to write a review in this area. So I read some of those papers I talked about from McGrew and Goodall and so on, who were suggesting that there was this diversity there. But I was dissatisfied with the methodology there. I could see, excuse me, there were holes in it. And that really what we needed was this collaborative effort, systematic effort. So I first invited a couple of the people who'd done this. I think it was Bill McGrew and Christoph Busch, and got them excited about the idea. Then, having done that, I approached Jane Goodall, who, as it were, is the next thing to God in our field, and the queen of the field, and she agreed. And I think once Jane was on board, then everyone else didn't want to be missed out. Yeah, but the fact it was me coming from outside, as you indicated, I was a primate behavioral ecologist at that point, but I'd mainly been studying baboons. I'd started doing some captive work with chimpanzees, with experiments, which really was what got me into this, because I thought it was important to do the complementary experimental work that happened to be chimpanzees, but my main reputation was perhaps in baboon behavioral ecology. So I was a kind of safe pair of hands that they could all perhaps all trust, the honest broker. And of course, they're such a group, a bunch of, dare I say it, prima donnas, the likes of Jane Goodall, Bill McGrew, Christoph Busch, Richard Wrangham, that none of them could have probably done it, or none of the others would have allowed them to do it. So, where we are these primates, we have these primate ways of going about our business. And I guess a lot of that was actually revealed in, Franz de Waal talked about chimpanzee politics. Here we have Homo sapiens science politics underlying the way that the science got done. But it's had a lot of impact. So it was a good move to make. And I must say, yes, I think I'd forgotten that conversation with Mike Huffman, that probably played a part in that as well.
We were on the bus just leaving from PRI, going off to dinner somewhere. Yeah.
Okay. Well, how appropriate.
Christoph tried in 2005 at a meeting we had in Germany on culture to get everyone's information, and then it flopped. So I'm glad you took the initiative and kept at it. I think it was you that made it work. Good job.
Yeah. Well, it really needs redoing now.
Yeah. With more groups out there now, it's really.
It was such a gargantuan task that I hope perhaps someone in the audience there would like to take on this now gargantuan task, but I'm sure it would repay the effort.
Yeah. We have one question from YouTube, and then I think we should cut it. But this one's coming in from our friend Vernon Reynolds. I'd like to get it. So he's asking, or he says, "Hi, Andy, very interesting talk. Is there any evidence from animals that some cultures can compete with others and destroy them?"
Hi, Vernon. Lovely to hear from you. An old friend. As you could probably tell, nothing is bursting into my consciousness on that. It's the thing about all these Q&As I find, I'm sure we all find them, 5 minutes time, I'm going to be sitting around with my friends here having breakfast because it's breakfast time in the UK. And I'll say, they asked this question. And of course, there's this example, there's that example. And I should have thought of that. But if I do think about an example, I shall be directly in touch with Vernon and some of the rest of you. But nothing's really occurring to me.
There's the one example
question.
you gave with the vervets and the colored food. The males, the culture they brought in disappeared when they conformed to the group they moved into.
Well, that's right. But I would say that's almost the opposite, so they give up what they know. And so I think one of the big questions in this whole area is that, there are two things that could happen when individuals from one community go into the next one. And, in most species, there's some dispersion of one sex or the other, sometimes more than one sex disperses at adulthood. They can go in and conform to the local culture, which then, as it were, reduces the possibility for cultural evolution, or they can take with them some particular culture that then does actually spread. And we've got just a few examples of that happening, not that it necessarily takes over from something that was there before, but a new invention, a new technique, new foraging technique, for example, or tool use in chimpanzees. There's one or two examples of that. But we don't really know as to what throws the switch so that it goes one way so that the culture does spread, or that instead the animal gives up what it knows and conforms to what everybody local is doing. I think that's one of the really interesting and important questions for the future. So, good question to raise that.
Yes, we like to end our International Primatology lecture series with the Stump the Expert question. So thank you, Vernon. We'll end there. And thank you, Professor Whiten, for this wonderful opportunity of sharing with all of us.
Okay, well, thanks for giving me the opportunity. Yeah, good luck with all the rest.